In this, our second lecture on neoclassicism, we shall shift our focus to Longinus' treatise on the sublime. We shall explore Longinus' view of the proper nature of sublimity and enumerate his rules of thumb for achieving it. We shall next analyze his pragmatic approach to theory and his influential conception of the ideal audience for sublime literature. Finally, we shall watch with awe as Longinus mounts a direct refutation of Plato's Republic that not only converts Plato's negatives into positives, but transforms Plato himself into one of the most sublime poets of all time. Now, I should say that On the Sublime, like Aristotle's Poetics, is a very systematic work. It almost reads like an outline, very logical, like a proof. And it's very easy and clear to read. Something important. The author of this work on the Sublime is traditionally called Longinus. But we now know that it was not written by him. Longinus is a later figure. We now know that it was written by an anonymous writer, almost surely in the 1st century A.D., perhaps 2 generations after Horace. He's still living in Rome, but a little bit past the Golden Age, the second half, perhaps, of the 1st century A.D. But I will call him Longinus. He continues to be called Longinus. In his work, Longinus attempts both to define the nature of the sublime and to lay down methods for achieving sublimity in writing. This will remind you of Aristotle's 2-prong approach, where he first discovers the elements that make it great and then sets down criteria to reproduce it. Pretty much Longinus is doing the same, but specifically for what we call the sublime, which I will define in a moment. Now, the main focus of this work is poetry. Sublimity is pretty much linked to poetry, but he does give examples of prose, Plato's prose particularly. Let's give a definition. Sublimity refers to a certain type of elevated language that strikes its listener with the mighty and irresistible power of a thunderbolt. When you hear the sublime, you are bowled over by it. Unlike rhetoric, which merely persuades, the sublime overwhelms its audience, literally carrying them away to a higher realm of experience. Now, you can use the sublime to persuade, but rhetoric just wants to get you to agree with them. Sublimity doesn't just want your assent. It wants your soul, if you will. It wants to carry you away, overwhelm you, just knock you over, again, like the thunderbolt. The sublime is so powerful that it has the power to unite contradictions. There's a Latin phrase, concordia discors, which means unity out of disunity, or concord out of discord. And what happens is that the sublime is so powerful, it takes things that are even opposite and fuses them together. All different ideas and emotions can get all suddenly fused together in what we might call the crucible of the sublime. Another aspect, a sublime passage can be heard again and again with equal pleasure. No matter how many times you hear it, it's ever fresh and new, and you're overwhelmed all over again. That's an aspect of the sublime. Indeed, the sublime and its power to transport us transcends both time and space. And what I want to do now for a second is recite to you an example of sublimity, because I think that's the best way of doing it. And what I'm going to do is recite for you the last 15 lines or so of Tennyson's famous poem, Ulysses. Ulysses is the Latin name of Odysseus. And in this poem, Ulysses has returned to Ithaca. It's 3 years after his return, and he's bored. He wants to leave and go on one last adventure, one last epic sea journey to discover the unknown. And in the passage I'm going to read, it's the last part of the poem, he's calling on his mariners to join him on this one last quest for adventure and discovery. See if you are overwhelmed. Ulysses says, "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting when an otter smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be that we will touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Now that's an example of sublimity. It's a work of poetry that carries us away. When I listen to that poem, and I can recite it again and again and hear it again and again, and I'm transported again. It's as if I join Ulysses on his journey. I'm taken away to this, this higher realm, this world of being, if you will. Another place, a higher mode of being or of existence. And you can hear it again and again, and it still has the same power. That, to me, is the sublime. Now, I told you that this is a systematic work. And so Longinus, like a good mathematician, not only tells us what sublimity is, but what it is not. This is sort of like that Socratic dialectic I told you, that platonic dialectic, where you wipe away what is false to get to what is true. Let me tell you 3 things that Longinus tells us the sublime is not, before we go back to the positive. First of all, sublimity is not bathos or bombast. What is that? That is all that overwrought, pseudo-tragic claptrap that we associate today with melodramatic soap operas. You know, like a bad silent movie where everybody's, with all this tragic posing, and it's you're trying to be serious, but the subject matter does not befit this kind of treatment. We call that bathos. That's an older word. We still use the word bombast. It's similar to our word pompous, which really means full of hot air, pomposity. That is not what the sublime is. Even if the language is beautiful, if the subject matter does not fit that treatment, it's bombast. It's not sublimity. Another thing sublimity is not. It is not inflated, hyperbolic language that is used inappropriately to heighten subjects that do not merit such treatment. In other words, to go back to Horace, it's not a purple passage. It's not something that you do just to impress people, but that doesn't belong there. Again, sublimity is not just pretty words. There's got to be feeling and ideas behind it. We'll hear more of this as we go along. Finally, sublimity is not merely the use of fashionable expressions or fanciful images. It's not just some kind of high-class literati kind of thing. It's not just being refined. Sublime is more than that. Let's come back now and talk more about it from a positive point of view. In a famous phrase, Longinus says that sublimity is the echo of a great soul. The echo of a great soul. Now, on the surface, such a phrase would suggest that sublimity lies totally in the realm of genius and is thus limited to those born with the gift. If you think of the echo of a great soul, that alone suggests this is genius. You're either born with it or you're not. You either have a great soul or you don't. And indeed, part of Longinus is genius. Let me give you an example where the genius side of the sublime, as opposed to the art side, comes out. Longinus believed it was a better thing to produce one great work of sublimity than 100 faultless but passionless poems. You can write the most beautiful, lucid, fluid, just have complete control of the poetic medium. But if it doesn't have the requisite passion and sublimity, then it's going to be forgotten. And again, he actually said, better to write one sublime passage than 100 that are faultless, but not very good or not very sublime. The example I like to give is a great dramatic monologue, a poem by Robert Browning called Andrea del Sardo. This is a poem that's based on a real person. He was an artist, a Renaissance artist, who was a contemporary of Raphael and Michelangelo. And he was known as the faultless painter because Andrea del Sardo, if he could imagine something or see it, he could reproduce it on the canvas flawlessly. Everybody envied him because anything he saw, he could reproduce. But you know what the problem was? Andrea del Sardo lacked the passion. He could draw whatever he imagined, but his imagination was limited. And so, even though Raphael and Michelangelo and Leonardo have flaws, their sublime passion rises them above Andrea del Sardo. So again, there's that aspect of genius. To a certain extent, you're born with it or you're not. However, Longinus does make it clear that the sublime is the mixed product. Again, if you take it out of context, it sounds like only genius. But if you read the whole thing, it's clear that genius and art both have a role in the sublime. In other words, there is a component of skill involved in the sublime. Again, we've got the debate we've looked at and we'll look at again between genius and art, that perennial debate. Now, actually, Longinus, like most neoclassical writers, is going to come a little bit more to art, despite what I told you. I know he contradicts himself a little bit here, but again, just a little bit of edge to art, because if you can't reproduce it, what's the point of writing a systematic treatise telling you how to do it, right? I mean, there's got to be some art involved. In his work, Longinus, after telling us what sublimity is and what it is not, Longinus proceeds to lay down 5 sources of the sublime. He actually gives us 5 sources, and 2 of these sources we can link to genius. The other 3 we can link to art. So again, there's a little bit of balance towards art if you kind of do it numerically. Let's look at the genius qualities, first of all. The first 2 sources of the sublime are grounded in an innate ability to conceive great thoughts and feel great passions. Great thoughts and great passions. And really, those are finally gifts of genius. It's hard to learn to have great thoughts or great passions. I mean, you can expose yourself to great art, but to a certain extent, if you're really going to have these great thoughts and passions, that's really a gift of genius. Horace, in one of his poems, speaks about he on whom the muse breathes. You know, the goddesses who inspired poetry. So there is that genius side. You have to be born with this big soul. However, the final 3 out of the 5 all lie within the scope of art. They constitute a craft that can, through hard work, be acquired. And the word craft in Greek is the word techne. That's an important word. It's actually the source of our word technology. But techne means craft or art or skill. And there's a techne of writing poetry. There's a techne of pottery, a techne of shipbuilding, a techne of weaving. I mean, so this idea that actually goes all the way back to Homer, and it was important in Plato, this idea of the art. And there is, again, a skill to the sublime. Let's look at the way that works. These sources, the 3 that are linked to techne, have to do not with the thoughts and passions themselves, but with how they are embodied in words, that's 1, syntax, 2, and poetic figures, 3. So it's not enough to have great thoughts and great passions. You need to embody those in the proper, again, words and syntax and poetic figures. Poetic figures are like metaphors and similes and symbols and whatnot. So again, I think if you're listening to me, you're realizing that we've got a touch of decorum here. We've got an idea of fitting, of great thoughts and ideas fitted to the proper words. And so even something as awesome and powerful as the sublime also has to obey the rules of decorum. There has to be a fittedness between the words and the passions. Now, one of the ways Longinus explains this to us is he actually quotes copious passages from classical poetry of the sublime. He actually quotes the book of Genesis. It's interesting. When God said, "Let there be light," he sees that as a very sublime moment in terms of poetry. And he also quotes Homer, and he quotes Sappho. Some of you have heard of the famous woman poet. She wrote love poetry in the classical world. And what's interesting is some of Sappho's poems only survive because Longinus quotes them as examples of the sublime. So it's kind of interesting. Longinus has actually preserved some poetry for us that would have otherwise been lost. Very interesting. All right, let's turn to another aspect of Longinus. As a neoclassicist, Horace helped to establish ground rules for the craft of poetry. We're going to look at those ground rules more in Lecture 8, but I want you to realize that all neoclassicists, in one way or another, set down ground rules, not just decorum, but rules and regulations. That's neoclassical. Let's look at some of Longinus's ground rules. First of all, he believed that there must be an appropriate, rational, organic relationship between form and content. Sound familiar? It should. Decorum, don't mix genres. But he states it again in his own way. According to Longinus, the high and the low, the serious and the comic must never be allowed to mix. Again, he believes in decorum. He uses different words, but again, there's a sort of sphere in which neoclassicists often work, and decorum is one of them. Another thing, and we heard this before, according to Longinus, but he develops it more than Horace, poets should attempt to mimic in the sound of their poetry the sense that they are trying to convey. And this is even more important in sublime poetry than any other kind of poetry. Sound and sense. Longinus, that's important to him. Finally, according to Longinus, the best kind of art hides itself. It seems more natural than nature herself. And let me go back to those classic Hollywood films I love from the 30s and 40s. They're a perfect example of art hiding itself. If you see a lot of foreign films, they love to play with camera work, and they love to point the finger at the camera. As opposed to Frank Capra would be the classic embodiment of Hollywood style. He is a master of camera movement, Frank Capra, but he never points attention to the camera work. We feel the impact of it, but it's never center stage. In that sense, that's very much a Longinian and a Horatian idea that art should hide itself. All right, let's turn to another aspect of Longinus. Longinus is, in part, a pragmatic theorist. Remember we said pragmatic theories, the poem and the audience. Like Horace, he is interested in the audience. And indeed, as we have already seen, Longinus defines the sublime not just in terms of its nature and essence. That's a mimetic view. What is the essence or nature of the sublime? But he's also pragmatic because he defines the sublime in terms of the reaction it elicits in its audience. When I define the sublime, or Longinus defined the sublime, as something that carries away or transports the audience, that's pragmatic, right? Because it's the impact on the audience. Now, he develops, though, from Horace, because he tells us that the best audience for the sublime is a refined, cultivated one. Again, we saw a little bit of this in Aristotle. Such hearers, the refined, cultivated audience, such hearers have sensitive souls that are uplifted by sublimity. In fact, only such an audience is able to judge the relative sublimity of a work. The only person capable of really judging whether something is sublime as opposed to bombastic or hyperbolic is if they are sensitive and refined. If they're not going to be able to do it. Let me give you an example of an audience that cannot judge the sublime. Teenagers who spend all day listening to rap music and heavy metal have no subtlety and could never distinguish the sublime. They're used to being blown over with, loud music and all this stuff. They do not have the discriminatory powers. We'll talk about this idea later in some other lectures. But we start to get this idea of the refined audience. Now, this attitude, which is central to neoclassicism, is somewhat aristocratic and elitist, is it not? Since the audience Longinus desires must be free from the low and vulgar thoughts that generally accompany rustic toil. If you're out working as a peasant, breaking your back, you're not going to have time to refine yourself. So we can say this is a little bit elitist and aristocratic. But I don't know that that's a problem, okay? Today in our modern democratic society, if it's elitist, it must be bad. I don't know. I think that's one of our prejudices, being in a democratic country. I don't know that it's necessarily bad. Neoclassical literature and neoclassical theory is very much in the ambit of courts and royalty and aristocracy. Think about Handel's water music. That's something that aristocrats listen to. That's very neoclassical, very Baroque. As opposed to Tchaikovsky, where, even the peasants listen to it, right? I mean, again, there's a difference here between the neoclassical and the romantic, and of course we'll come back to that when we get to romanticism. I just want to end by saying that this attitude that poetry is really for an elite, refined audience, that's not really going to be challenged until you get to romanticism, where they start wanting to spread out to the people. Now, there is, of course, one exception, and that is Shakespeare, who's always the exception to a rule. Shakespeare somehow had the ability to appeal to both audiences. But how did he do it? He broke decorum left and right. In other words, how did he get the people in the gallery? It's the sword fights and the pageants and whatnot. So the reason he was able to move beyond the neoclassical audience was because Shakespeare broke neoclassical decorum. So he's an odd figure, Shakespeare. Finally, and this is my favorite part of Longinus, Longinus answers Plato's attack on the poets by turning Plato on his head. Believe me, by the end of the series, Plato's going to be dizzy from spinning around in his grave. Consistently, Longinus presents Plato as himself a master of the sublime. I love this. Plato would say, don't do me any compliments here. He's having fun. He actually quotes passages from Plato's prose as models of sublimity. I told you it's mostly poetry, but when he quotes prose, it tends to be Plato. Plato's prose is as sublime as epic poetry. He shows, Longinus shows, how Plato often gets caught up in a swell of sublime passion. He shows that Plato, too, is carried away with sublimity in his... And he actually quotes these. He proves it, so to speak, to us. Indeed, he argues that it is often the poetic power of Plato's imagery that drives home his philosophical points. I sort of alluded to this in Lecture 2, and it's true. To me, Plato really hits home in his myths and his allegories. Some of you are familiar with the allegory of the cave. That's when you really understand his metaphysics. I don't have time to go into the allegory of the cave, but I mentioned to you the myth of about life and death and rebirth. It's really his myths that I would say concretize or embody. When I read those sublime myths and allegories of Plato, that's when I understand him viscerally. You know that word, along your viscera, along your veins and arteries. That's when you feel Plato. So it's when Plato's the most sublime that I think he's the most persuasive and actually the most easy to understand, if you will. Let's go more. He's not done with Plato. With great irony, Longinus posits as the source of Plato's sublimity his near possession by the sublime spirit of Homer. Isn't this wonderful? The reason Plato is so sublime is because he's possessed, like the Ion, he's possessed by Homer. And I'll tell you, in the Republic, he quotes Homer again and again. And a lot of time, Plato gets it a little bit wrong. You know why? He's quoting from memory. Plato knows this Homer by memory, and he quotes him. In other words, what am I saying? The divine madness which Plato exposes in his Ion as a form of contagion, for Longinus, it is a higher form of mimesis. Sometimes critics deal with the same reality, but interpret it totally different ways, partly based on their assumptions. Indeed, what appears as possession is really a kind of wrestling, a struggle on the part of Plato to exceed his poetic master. According to Longinus, there's a struggle, what the Greeks called an agon, a wrestling match going on between Plato and Homer. And out of that struggle, out of Plato's struggle to outdo Homer, comes the great art. Now, some of you may have heard of a critic at Yale, I believe, named Harold Bloom. He wrote a very influential book called The Anxiety of Influence. And what the anxiety of influence, it defines an artistic and psychological need on the part of one poet to outdo his strongest predecessor. In other words, what Harold Bloom is saying is that if you're a poet living today, you have got to beat out your predecessor, the great poet that came before you, to establish yourself. This is very Oedipal, isn't it? The idea of the son having to rise up and slay his father. So again, and Harold Bloom doesn't say this, but I think he got it partly from Longinus. But maybe it's an anxiety of influence, so he didn't tell us it was from Longinus. Now, for Bloom, that struggle is sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes psychologically good, sometimes damaging. For Longinus, the struggle is a good one. It is productive of good art. To seek to imitate and exceed a past master, Longinus tells us, is not a form of plagiarism, but of tribute. So for him, it's Oedipal, but it's not so much, I've got to kill Homer. It's, I've got to imitate him and do better. But to do better is a kind of tribute. So it's kind of hard to entangle. Some of it sounds negative, some of it sounds positive. But the idea is that there's a struggle, and out of that struggle comes sublimity and comes great art. Let's add to this, according to Longinus, that same sublime spirit that passes from Homer down to Plato continues to pass down from Plato to his reader. We're back to that magnet with the 3 rings I told you about in Lecture 2, this idea of contagion. The only difference is that for Plato, that was, I called it Woodstock, madness, craziness, everybody going wild. For Longinus, this is good. This sublimity is passing down 3 levels. It's a good kind of madness. Indeed, for Longinus, this inspiration ennobles and uplifts the soul of all those who come in contact with it. It makes them richer, fuller men, and better, nobler citizens. This inspiration does not make us worse. It makes us better. It uplifts and ennobles us and makes us better citizens. Finally, in the sublime conclusion to his treatise, Longinus not only offers his fullest refutation of Plato, but defines the greatest threat to cultural refinement. Now, how does he work up to this? First, Longinus laments that his age is not conducive to sublime art. He just missed Horace's age by maybe 60 years, and like Aristotle, he felt that he was born too late. Harold Bloom, to go back to him, calls this a sense of belatedness, a little bit too late. And don't we all feel we were born too late, right? Oh, I wish I was, if I was a little bit earlier, I would have been great. There's that feeling. Well, that's how Longinus felt. And I believe that one of the purposes of On the Sublime is the same purpose as Aristotle's Poetics, namely, to inspire and equip a new golden age of poets. So he realizes, I'm living in an unheroic, unsublime age. Let me bring back sublimity. All right, that's what he begins. Then from there, he starts to tell us what it is that kills the sublime. Why is he in a non-sublime age? And this is the fun part. Because at first, Longinus appears to suggest that the ultimate threat to sublimity is tyranny. He sort of plays with us at the end of his essay. He starts by making it sound like if you've got a tyrant and you're a slave, you can't have sublimity. But that's where he tricks us. With an unexpected, and I would say sublime turn, he reveals that there is actually something worse than the loss of freedom. There is something that is anti-sublime even more than tyranny. And what that is, the supreme killers of the sublime are materialism and hedonism. According to Longinus, and it's kind of a moral ending, the lust for money and pleasure yields petty, ignoble thoughts. It breeds both vanity and insolence and snuffs out the sublime spark of the soul. For Longinus, even political slavery is better than that. I mean, if you are enslaved in your body, at least your soul is free to be sublime and to be creative and to overwhelm, If you are materialistic and hedonistic and you think petty thoughts and are grubbing after what they call filthy lucre and pleasure, then that kills the sublime. What we today call Philistinism, okay? The Philistines who don't have a respect for art, that is what kills. If they want to buy art, then that starts to kill the sublime. That is the greatest danger. According to Longinus, the true sublime poet must rise above our petty world of cares. If you're so focused on the material world and money grubbing and pleasure grubbing and all of that, then your face is on the ground. Sublimity is something that rises above. It wants to take petty thoughts and lift them up and make them sublime. What am I saying? And what is Longinus saying? He's saying that sublime poets must, like the Platonic philosopher, shun the false illusions of this world if he is to achieve his goal. And thus, ironically, a treatise on poetry, which Plato thought so deleterious to the morals of his republic, ends with a powerful moral critique of society. Let me stop and explain here. For Plato, it is philosophy that makes us better and more nobler citizens and makes us rise above petty cares. For Longinus, he turns it around. He says, no, it's not philosophy, it's sublime poetry that makes us finally morally better. Because when you leave the world beyond and look for sublimity, you're doing something that's, quote, spiritual. And so the great irony here is it's almost as if Longinus is suggesting we don't need philosopher kings, we need poet kings. It's poetry, not philosophy, that makes us more moral. And so once again, Plato gets turned on his head. Instead of creating a separate space for poetry, he does the other tactic I told you about. He shows us that poetry is in fact the highest kind of philosophy and is what the perfect republic really needs. In our next lecture, we will jump ahead almost 1,500 years to the Renaissance to look at Sir Philip Sidney's great defense of poetry.